Thank you all for coming to this event. So I'm going to skip the introduction of Kevin and Orville, and you all saw the book. It's 600 pages long, but don't be intimidated by it. 200 pages of them are footnotes and bibliographies. So it's only 400 pages long. And Kevin, I have to say, I can't imagine you spending years of time reading and analyzing and writing about what Xi Jinping says and thinks. Besides the reason you had to finish a doctoral dissertation at Oxford, why did you pick this subject, and what do you think? Why do you think it's important?
Firstly, it's great to be back home at the Asia Society. So all of my friends and colleagues here from New York and the Society, it's good to be home. And thank you, Li Yuan, for being with us, and Orville as well, who's been a partner in crime with myself for quite a long period of time now. So why do it? I suppose, having grown up as a Roman Catholic, you have an early taste for self-flagellation. So that was a joke for any sort of serious Catholics in the audience, but I did grow up as a Roman Catholic. But I think it's along these lines that if you're a serious student of the Chinese Communist Party, which I've sought to be for most of my life, since I was a junior woodchuck at the Australian National University way back when, ideology has always been a subject which has loomed large in the party's internal discourse. And there's often been a temptation over the years, particularly in the post-Mao period, to reach an informal conclusion that, the Chinese are not serious about that, that it's just part of a gloss, that it's part of a chapeau, that the real politics and the real policy exists in an entirely different and pragmatic domain. And by the way, all my comments are those as a private scholar, not as an Australian ambassador to the United States. If they were in the latter, then I'd become very boring very quickly, what I was saying here today. So grant me that dispensation for the purposes of our conversation. So whereas my view is the more you read, and the more you read the Mao period, for example, and the scholars who spent a lot of time getting inside the head of the pre-49 Communist Party and the post-49 Communist Party, ideology has always mattered. It has mattered in terms of providing a worldview to organise an analysis of where China is in the world and, frankly, what to do with China in the world. Secondly, it's also a methodology through dialectical materialism and historical materialism for viewing reality. And I've reached a conclusion, having read a lot of this stuff, that if the Chinese system and the Chinese Communist Party, and particularly Xi Jinping's party, spends so much time on this, then that is not for no reason. It is because it's regarded as important internally. And if they regard it as important internally, then those of us in the analytical community should treat it with parallel levels of respect. And so the concluding reason in terms of why I would set out to do this is we've spent the last decade or so seeking to understand how Xi Jinping has changed China and changed China domestically and in its policy towards the world. The why question, which is why has he done that and what is his overall driving ideological framework for doing so, is something that has been less explored, which is why I thought it was a useful thing to do, which is why I read the Xi Jinping canon and produced 190 pages of footnotes and bibliography. And I'm sorry about all that. That's not mandatory part of the reading.
Yeah. Although you've been visiting China since 1974, if I'm not wrong, and I'm sure you've heard something that Kevin just refer to, some Chinese would say the Chinese Communist Party doesn't really have a real ideology. It only serves lip service to communism and Marxism, and its ultimate goal is to stay in power. How do you usually respond to those kind of comments?
Well, I think that wager is exactly what Kevin is trying to plumb in his book. Kevin, you spoke of being a Catholic, and I have to say, when your book landed on my desk, you noted, I think, in one of the early chapters that Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica, which is several thousand pages long, about everything that could be known in the 13th century about man's relation to God. I don't want to equate Xi Jinping with God, but I did have a kind of a feeling that this was an equivalent. And I think you would share that sentiment. So here's the question that occurs to me.
The Catholic Church would disagree with you.
Well, I'm sure, and I'm sure the Communist Party would too. So if ideology is important for Xi, I'm wondering how you think he got inoculated with that. Now, when he was a young man and got sent away for 7 years to be an educated youth in a very poor part of China, maybe this was the currency of the realm. Those were his formative years. But I wonder how you look back on those early years in terms of how he has become a sort of ideologue after a period when ideology didn't matter that much in China.
The book deliberately sets out not to be a biography of Xi Jinping, in part because others have done this, but in part because I'm not a psychologist, and I find it very difficult to plumb the depths of a man's or a woman's soul in terms of who they are or why they act in a particular way. Mine's a more modest ambition. If you like, it's more of an intellectual biography. It's an ideological biography, which is how has he changed China's known ideological settings as of when he became leader in 2012 to what they are today, and the extent to which those ideological shifts have become barometers or indicators, or in some cases precursors, of real policy and behavioural change in the real world. So to go to your question, therefore, of why ideology in Xi's case, and given the caveat, which is I can't answer, questions about his personal background effectively. But my conclusion from his writings is as follows. Xi Jinping has been deeply traumatized by the collapse of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Deeply traumatized by it. It is so redolent in his writings and his reflections and his speech-making over a long period of time that as he observes what happens with the Bolshevik Revolution in 2017, his observations that where was the Red Army, where was ideology in the critical events of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, that his equation in his own mind is in the absence of a strong and continuing powerful Leninist state with a coherent set of ideological belief, and he uses the term belief and faith, Xinyang, in a semi-religious way, and the need to be rebaptized, his term, not mine, in that faith, that for him ideology is in part the answer, together with the disciplines of a Leninist party, to hold the country together and to prevent what he sees as the implosion of the then Soviet Union and the dismemberment of what was then the Soviet Union to a multiplicity of states. So I think what I can deduce from his writings is that this has been a galvanizing experience factor in his mind, and it has driven him over a long period of time during the 90s towards this clear statement of ideology. If you go to his pre-2012 writings, when he's been provincial secretary, either in party secretary in either Fujian or in Zhejiang or in Shanghai, there is a reasonable continuity in terms of his views on the centrality of Marxism-Leninism. And I think the last thing that I'd just say on the evidentiary front when people say, well, maybe you're just getting this wrong, Kevin. You are overstating the reality of the significance of ideology. Here is Mao's oeuvre on ideology, on Marxism and Leninism. Here is Deng's, here is Jiang's, here is Hu Jintao's, and here is Xi Jinping's. There is a quantitative factor here. So I always bring myself back to the empirical question, why? They do not do this stuff for fun. It's for a purpose. And I think the purpose that I can best deduce is this level of anxiety that's come out of the CPSU collapse. Plus, we should not underestimate the fact that he is seriously Hongerdai. He's second generation red. And therefore, if you're part of the party's ancestral tradition from the founders or those who worked with the founders, as the case with his father, Xi Jinping, despite the fact that Xi Jinping went through multiple traumas during the Cultural Revolution and before, this quest to retain the centrality of the Leninist party has an additional personal dimension and familial dimension as well.
Since the so-called reform era, each of the Chinese leaders had their own policy frameworks, socialism with Chinese characteristics for Deng Xiaoping, 3 representatives, 3个代表 for Jiang Zemin, harmonious society for Hu Jintao, 和谐社会. And was there any ideological consistency among these leaders? Or in other words, has the Communist Party always been a party of ideology?
It certainly has always been a party of ideology, and right from the get-go in 1921. You read the records of the first Congress and the second Congress, these ideological questions, including the nascent party's role within China and the world. These are lively and active deliberations from the beginning. The question is to what extent has the ideological framework changed between the leaders that you've just referred to? If I was to put it into this sort of sweep of history, between, frankly, 49 and 56 in the 8th Congress of the party, Mao Zedong and the Central Committee for this period of time regarded class struggle as the central organizing principle for the party, and that is to deal with the enemy classes from within. And that's when you saw the anti-landlord movement, you saw the collectivization of industry, the collectivization of agriculture, etc. Then you get to 56 in the 8th Party Congress, and you see a resolution actually emerging from the 8th Congress which says, okay, we've just had 7 years of class struggle. We think we've dealt with the landlord class. We've dealt with the capitalist entrepreneurial class. We've now socialized the means of production. So let's get on with building the economy. And if you look at the resolution of the 8th Congress in 56, it was along those lines, which is let's unleash the factors of production. Mao Zedong then, by the late 50s, when he launches the anti-rightist campaign, and then engages in the Great Leap Forward, and then engages in the Cultural Revolution, effectively says to the party leadership, the pragmatic party leadership of Deng Xiaoping and of Chen Yun and others who are seeking to build the economy, no way, Jose. He's saying that if you go down that road, then you will actually incrementally recreate a capitalist class within the country. And so you see this enormous sort of lurch to the left over this period of time, through until Mao's death. What I find fascinating is that when Deng emerges after 78 and through until the party's historical resolution, second historical resolution in 1981, is that in this period of time, the official critique of Mao and the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and the anti-rightist campaign was as follows, that Mao violated the 56 resolution of the 8th Party Congress to place the economy at the centre and the unleashing of the factors of production to grow the economy. And this became, therefore, the official ideological reset by Deng, Jiang, and Hu, and in between, of course, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, who were both purged, for the period of what we describe as economic pragmatism. Within Jiang Zemin and within Hu Jintao, they have had different twists on this theme. You mentioned Jiang Zemin and the Sangadaibiao, the theory that three represents. Very much that was a case of, well, we're creating this entrepreneurial class within China. Mao warned us about this back in the 50s. What are we going to do about it? And Jiang Zemin's novel solution, as you know, Orville and Li Yuan, is pretty simple. We're going to put them into the party and make them into patriotic capitalists. And that's what decoded the theory the three represents is about. And then Hu Jintao, again staying within the Deng Xiaoping frame, says we've got some emerging additional challenges, which is about social harmony, but also about environmental sustainability. And when he talks about a theory of scientific development, right, scientific economic development, he is saying that we've got to deal with this emerging set of challenges within the Deng Xiaoping paradigm in order to sustain still the development of the factors of production. It's only when we get to Xi Jinping, and not straight away in 2012, but in fact at the 19th Congress in 2017, that he looks back at this great sweep of history and says, yep, but the problem with the last 35 years since the second historical resolution back in 1981 is that we have unnecessarily and excessively relegated what Marxist-Leninists call the relations of production. What's that mean? Class. Mm-hmm. So in other words, we've come back to an earlier frame. And he's not saying we therefore repudiate economic development, but we're saying it now has to be done in a manner which manages class inequality, but in addition to that, reasserts the centrality of a Leninist party. And so why does ideology matter? Each of these formal resets from 56 through to 78, 81, through to what happened then in 2017, have been these major, shall we say, inflection points in what then became a series of subsidiary policy and behavioural changes in the Chinese system.
Yeah. As you wrote in the book, since Xi Jinping came to power in late 2012, he has turned much of China's political, economic, and foreign policy on its head. So why did he do that? Why was he so determined?
I think one of the most insightful speeches that we have, and an associated leaked document, which is document number 9, which came out in 2013, 2014. And the associated speech with it, which was Xi Jinping's address, I think in July of 13.
But it was never actually released officially.
That's true. There's a complex sub-debate about the speech and the document, about what was officially released, which was something this long, the full speech was this long, and then they've got document number 9 over here. Anyway, without boring everyone senseless about all of that, the bottom line is, it is very early in his period, but it is Xi Jinping, as I say, unbuttoned on what he really thinks about ideology and propaganda. And it is, the language used in it is quite stark in terms of his identification of the centrality of the ideological unravelling that he feared was occurring within the Communist Party. He uses quite frank expressions such as, there are many, many contradictions, Maodun, which have emerged over the previous 35 years, which my predecessors have not addressed. And therefore, I must now deal with the imbalances in development. And so in that speech, what you see, I think, are the emblematic elements of 3 significant ideological changes coming out of his belief structure. Number 1 is the party itself has become relegated. And we cannot, as Chinese communists, allow that to continue to happen. And it's the origins of what I describe as Xi Jinping's clear assertion that he will now take Chinese politics back to the Leninist left. That is, with a much more centrally empowered party. You know, his aphorism, which he borrows from Mao, it doesn't matter whether it's north, south, east, or west, whether it's the party, or whether it's politics, whether it's the military, whether it's the economy, whether it's society, whether it's the academy, the party leads in all. It's a pretty unambiguous statement. On his Marxism, you see less of this in his 2013 speech, more of it by the time you get to 2017, but also an indication that the impact of this sustained period of market-based economic reforms has been actually corrupting the party. And remember, this is the year that he launches the anti-corruption campaign, which is the longest continuing campaign in party history as of today. And the third thing you see in this, this early speech is what I describe as his nationalist theme, which is him saying it is time for the party to cease apologising for its qualities. It's time for China to cease apologising for, quote, not being like the West. And there is a cri de coeur, almost a call to arms, to saying it's time to assert instead why China is different, why the Chinese Communist Party is different, and to take the fight on in the international community. Rather than being in a passive position, for example, and defensive on questions of Marxist-Leninist doctrines of human rights, let us go on the offensive and in fact attack the double standards in the West and defend that which we are doing here more aggressively. So you ask, how or why did he make those changes? I think you see the kernel of them all quite early in this pretty much unbuttoned and frank speech, which then is not just left hanging there as a piece of speechcraft, but then is reinforced by document number 9, which is in fact an instruction to the Chinese system about ideological tightening.
Kevin, I wonder if, you know, we had this period when Deng Xiaoping came to power when ideology was much less important. And so you went through this period, 1989, and then you went through Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. I wonder if Xi Jinping didn't think emphasizing Leninism, emphasizing the importance of the party, if he didn't think, you know, without ideology, what am I? I'm just another tin pot dictator, right? So buoyed and sort of ideology then might have occurred to him as a kind of a intellectual system, a flotation device that gave him some legitimacy, placed him in history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Without it, he really is nothing more than another big leader.
I agree with you, Orville, that the totalizing dimensions of Marxism-Leninism provides an integrated worldview. It is not just viewing the world through the lens of historical materialism, which is the evolution from slave societies through to communist societies. It's not just a view of dialectical materialism, which is here are the conflicts in society and the economy and politics today, which we, the Leninist Party, will advance by our direct intervention in history. It provides you not just with a millenarian destination point, going back to our Roman Catholic analogies, it provides you with an ideological methodology for interpreting reality on the way through. And so to your point, you can either be, as it were, in the Chinese historical tradition, an emperor, and then anchored in the deep but mysterious cosmology of the Son of Heaven, or you have an integrated ideological worldview about the future of Chinese society, the future of China in the world as a continuing revolutionary force.
And Xi Jinping then becomes sort of part of destiny.
That's true. And so, within the history of the Chinese Communist Party, the leader back to Mao's day, and even before Mao, if you go back to the earliest days of the contested foundings of the party after 21, when Mao was not, as you know, preeminent leader until after Zuni in 35, 36. Each purported leader of the Chinese Communist Party has to have been a former philosopher king. That is, the interpreter of the ideological tradition and the definer of it. You said before that Deng Xiaoping didn't place much emphasis on ideology. Yes and no. No, if you look at the size of his oeuvre, but at the get-go, when he's dealing with the Maoist ideological excesses of the past, he uses ideology, Marxism-Leninism, to point to the fact that Mao was in error in departing from the orthodoxy of 1956, when the Central Committee determined that the central challenge for the party for the future was unleashing the factors of production, that is, growing the economy, as opposed to being preoccupied with the relations of production, which is class struggle. And if you like, these are the two dynamics, or the two dialectical forces in this evolving debate within the party over nearly 100 years. Are you going to emphasise class equality, or are you going to unleash the factors of production to grow the country, grow the strength of the economy, and to lift people's living standards on the way through? What is your central priority? And Deng had one set of conclusions about that, which Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao followed. Mao had a completely different set of conclusions. And Xi Jinping is seeking to find a way through, which is somewhere between those two traditions. So I think you are right. It is the organising principle. It is a belief structure. The number of times Xi Jinping uses Xinyang, something we normally associate with religious belief, being rebaptized in faith. The faith is Marxism-Leninism. Read his speech on the 200th anniversary of the birth of Marx in 2018. It's a fascinating speech. I cover it in the text there, where he refers to Das Kapital as the Bible of the working class, the Shengjing of the working class. So on the faith question, the belief question, the totalizing ideology / theology of the system, you're right, it occupies this role as well.
And he, as we were speaking about earlier, he actually mentions the risks of China losing its soul, which is losing Marxism-Leninism. This, again, this kind of strange equation of faith, whether we usually think of it in religious terms, but for him, it's in ideological terms.
Yeah, the analogies between the language of ideology and the language of faith, as reflected in the Xi Jinping canon, is quite strong. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The term faith, Xinyang, occurs repeatedly. Being rebaptized in Marxism-Leninism is a term which he uses conspicuously. As you said before, not losing our Linghun, our soul, which is a Marxist-Leninist soul, is his constant invocation to the party. The party being aware still of its founding mission, its Chufa, and its Shiming. These are missionary terms of the early church, and so you can see the architecture of this quite clearly. Therefore, I go back to my overall thesis. Ideology matters. It has mattered for 100 years in a Marxist-Leninist party as both an organising principle, as a principle of politics through the power of the Leninist party, but frankly also as an economic vision for the country and therefore for China in the world, but also China's future role in the world. And so therefore, I simply argue through the book, we need to rediscover its significance as an explanatory mechanism for Chinese behaviours in the world. It's not the single explanatory mechanism, and I say this as explanatory factor, and I say this a lot in the book. There are multiple other factors as well, but we've ignored this one.
Mm-hmm. So there's a quite popular view that the changes we are seeing in China over the last decade reflect the underlying and continuing nature of the Chinese Communist Party rather than the impact of any particular leader, i.e. Xi Jinping. Do you agree with this argument? I think people always say it. Is that Xi Jinping? Is that the party?
Well, this is the grand argument of the ages, and not just in Chinese politics, but in international and political science. Is it agency? Is it structure? Is it the structure of this thing called a Marxist-Leninist party? Is the agency of a particular leader in history? Reality, as I observe it anyway, is never a binary. reality is an uncomfortable cocktail of the above. The fact that we have had the structure of something called a Marxist-Leninist party, which has survived 100 years, and it has survived an extraordinary period of 28 years of civil war, when there were many near-run misses for the extinction of the communist movement, particularly in the 20s and the 30s. And throughout this history, therefore, the structure of the party and the Leninist party is of itself foundational. So we cannot simply relegate structure and say it's purely been the product of Mao's imagination or various political leaders' imagination. So the structure is there, and it's a formidable structure, those of us who are familiar with it. However, on the agency question, look at the agency of two leaders in particular, Deng and Xi. Absent the agency of Deng's leadership, we would not have had what occurred effectively in terms of the events of 78 to 81, 82, which redirected the entire orientation of Chinese politics and policy, both on society and politics and the economy and in foreign policy, for 35 years. It is very difficult to come up with a counter argument said that if there was no such person as Deng Xiaoping, would that have happened? I find that utterly unpersuasive against the evidence. So the agency of Deng's leadership in taking China in a direction which said, forget about class struggle, the central challenge is not the relations of production, but the factors of production. Doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. It's glorious to be rich. You remember all these statements? That governed the orthodoxy for 35 years. And that's the agency of Deng's leadership and, frankly, his followers, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. The agency of Xi Jinping's leadership in what he describes as the new era, Xin Shidai. And what's the new era mean? It's the non-Deng era. Xin Shidai effectively began in 2017, though on some now interpretations back to 2012. And he's saying that in this new era, through the agency of my leadership and Xi Jinping thought on the new era, that we have now entered into a post-Deng period where we are correcting all the imbalances which occurred during this period of reform, opening, and economic modernization and growth. So my argument is against the evidence. The agency factor of the two leaders, in this case, has been profound. But we cannot say that the structure, at the same time, of the underpinning Leninist party has been irrelevant. So it is a cocktail of both.
Yeah, I was really struck by one paragraph you said in your book. It's Xi's predecessors, they intentionally left the door of democracy a little bit open, and Xi slammed it shut. And as an intelligent man, he knows the cost of that. Can you explain a little bit of that? I was really struck by that.
If you look carefully, I think, at the period of Deng, Jiang, and Hu, what you saw, absent the events of 1989 and Tiananmen, and we can address that separately if you wish, is a view of China's political economy which said, we are going to unleash the factors of production. I know Deng Xiaoping says to himself privately that this will create all sorts of new tensions in society arising out of inequality. But that is a price that's worth paying in order to grow the economy, grow living standards, and some people in some regions will get rich first. So he actually embarked upon that as a strategic direction. And knowing full well that this, in the very long term, could end up with some deep reappraisals of where China landed on the critical question of democracy and capitalism. Neither Deng, nor Jiang, nor Hu ever said, and that is going to be our destination point, a departure from communist orthodoxy. But if you look carefully at their canon and what they experimented with, remember Jiang Zemin bringing capitalists into the party, which was regarded by Mao as ultimate heresy and heterodoxy. Hu Jintao's experimentation with local level democracy and local elections in villages, for example. Both these things have been quashed in the period of Xi Jinping. And so Xi Jinping, I think, mindful of what happened with the CPSU, mindful of the implosion of the Soviet Union, mindful of what happened with what he described in his earliest writings as ideology being like the fish rotting from the head. That is, if ideology begins to erode and corrode, so too does the organisational rigour of the party and its belief system. That he therefore concluded that I can see where this is going to go. The Soviets have given us an indication as to where this lands, and I'm not going to allow that to happen. So I use the analogy, he saw the future and he shut the door. Was he fully mindful of the domestic economic cost of shutting that door by taking the economy so far to the Marxist left? That's an open question. We're still debating the extent of the economic cost and therefore what now unfolds in terms of rising youth unemployment, slower growth, etc. But when people say he does not know what he is doing, within his Marxist-Leninist worldview, he has a very clear idea of what he's doing, which is preserve the party, preserve the ideological underpinnings of the party, and increasingly prepare for what he sees to be the national security contingencies of the future. Within his worldview, these are perfectly rational steps. And so therefore he saw that alternative future and shut those doors.
So Kevin, let me throw another element in the discussion here. We had a period, starting with Deng Xiaoping and really going almost all the way up to Xi Jinping, when the Western world was not emphasized as a hostile foreign force. That imputation was still there, but that wasn't the main theme. How do you analyze that contradiction, which was always existing between the nations that were imperialized and imperialist nations? Do you think we are back in a world where this idea of a hostile foreign force is an important part of Xi's sort of belief system? And if so, what does that mean for those of us who are in that hostile foreign force camp?
Let's speak for yourself.
I think Australia has got the scars to prove a little hostile foreign forceism.
I'm glad I'm speaking here in a private capacity. I think, remember, if this book of mine is about ideology, it's about a totalizing ideology and how the leadership at a particular time explains the world to the party and to the country. It's always worth asking ourselves, how did Deng do that? Before we go on to how is Xi doing that. And how did Deng do it? Deng said, starting from his domestic premise, which is class struggle is just making us poorer, and it gave us the Cultural Revolution. Neither of these things were good. Now we're going to grow the economy, and we're going to increase people's living standards. It's glorious to be rich. My mechanism for doing that is reform and opening. I'm going to reform agriculture, I'm going to reform industry, I'm going to unleash the private sector. And he did. Then he says to himself, how will this grow even further? Answer, consistent with the economic development theory of newly industrialized economies and countries, I must therefore engage in global markets. And thereby the normal path to economic development is for developing countries, poor developing countries, is a boom in net exports. And so that's exactly what happened with low-level labour-intensive manufacturers for export. And that is very much the genesis of China's economic transformation in the 80s and the 90s and into the noughties. And so how does he therefore explain the world? This is Deng Xiaoping. He says, out there in the world, what we're going to do is work within the US-led international economic system, because that's the reality, and we're simply going to work within that to make as much money as we can for the country. And he did. And therefore, if you read carefully Deng's writings in the period, he is saying that this period, which will last for generations and generations, was necessary as a unified domestic worldview, reform, global worldview, opening, 改革开放, in order to unleash the factors of production and to make China a powerful state, a powerful country, a powerful economy with high levels of living standards, while leaving open those doors we spoke of before, because he's smart enough to understood where those things can go. And so, in other words, Deng, within the ideological framework of Marxism and Leninism, justified all this in terms of what he described in the seminal documents of 1981 and 82 as the primary stage of socialism. The primary stage of socialism. And therefore, all these things were permissible. And when asked the question, how long is the primary stage of socialism? He said, generations and generations and generations, tens of generations. Well, that takes you into hundreds of years when you think about it. So we flip over to Xi Jinping. And we've discussed his earliest writings in 2013. And in his ideological view, he sees instead a range of other factors. He sees, of course, all the domestic inequality factors we've spoken of, and the need, therefore, to readdress the questions of the imbalances of development, and a new type of reform and opening. 改革开放，新的模式. In other words, it's no longer the unqualified, unrestricted reform and opening of the past. It will be a new type of reform and opening. And then you ask yourself, well, what type of new form of reform and opening will it be for the economy? It is one which, again, has the state at the centre. It is one which, therefore, has state-owned enterprises at the centre. It's one which is more sceptical of the untrammeled role of the Chinese private sector. It is one which leans heavily into state industrial policy, much more sceptical of the market, and with a new and emerging doctrine of common prosperity. And all within the frame of an increasingly adverse national security environment, which he concludes exists. And so therefore, Xi Jinping's worldview, as it extends to the world, and not just to China itself domestically, is one where he does see himself as an increasingly binary strategic contest with the United States and its allies. And you can see this, again, as redolent within the literature. And therefore, if you read the national security literature within China today, the binaries, again, in terms of China and Chineseness versus foreignism is becoming more acute than it was for the 35 years or so of the previous period. And so this is being reflected both as an ideological reflection by the party, as well as an active ingredient in day-to-day, shall we say, practical national security politics and the activities, for example, of the intelligence agencies. Civil society and civil society organizations in China have gone from this big to this big. Academic discourse within the country has gone from these parameters of the possible to these parameters of the possible, social credit scores and the rest. And so, and one of the ingredients in that is not just people's domestic loyalty to the party, but also their engagement with alternative worldviews, that is, of the international democratic capitalist order led by the United States. So we are ending up in a more Manichaean world as a consequence. And again, ideologically, these are clear points of contradistinction against that which preceded the Xi Jinping period, if you look at the earlier statements of Deng.
Mm-hmm. So how would you explain the many contradictions in Xi Jinping's policies? For instance, he advocates for both high-quality development and high-quality security. He wants to attract foreign direct investment, but he also wants to foster a mindset that treats all foreigners as potential spies. And he wants to strengthen state-owned enterprises, and while he says, I support the private sector, you're 自己人, you're one of our own. And, you know, it's all this what we Chinese said, 既要又要还要, not only but also and else. Are they, you know, how do you explain these contradictions?
Well, Chinese politics is not unique in having contradictions. I've seen a bit of that in Western countries as well, including our own. But certainly, if you look at the centrality of Xi Jinping's political and policy dilemma, it's along these lines. I want to preserve a Leninist party, an all-powerful Leninist party. At the same time, I want Chinese youth to believe that they have an ability to pursue their own dreams in life. Remember the whole campaign about the China dream, 中国梦, 我的梦, 中国的梦, my dream and China's dream. So if you like, between an all-powerful Leninist party and your ability to pursue your private dreams, you are running into, as it were, contradiction number one. On the economy, as you correctly identify, Xi Jinping is saying, we want, if you look carefully at the ideological statements, the formula around the 两个保护, the two guarantees, which is guaranteeing the role of a strong private sector and guaranteeing the role of an activist and reformed public sector, that is, state-owned enterprises. And to which we would say, well, yes, we would all want to achieve that balance. And in reality, where does the investment capital go? Increasingly in the direction of SOEs, and where is private fixed capital investment going for the private sector? Slowing down acutely. So therefore, within these domains of policy, both on pure politics, on society and the economy, and in terms of international policy, which is we are, as the Chinese party and state, preparing for international security policy contingencies, including Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, etc., and at the same time, we're wishing to stabilise our relationship with the United States and its allies, at least since the Woodlands summit between Xi Jinping and Biden in October last year. And so, again, there is a range of emerging tensions within that. What's Xi Jinping's ultimate resolution of this? As I observe it, and again, I go back to the ideological texts here, Xi Jinping constantly is appealing to the importance of maintaining ideological, political, and policy continuity, and that these other sources of friction and reaction will ultimately dissipate, including external political resolve on the part of the United States and its allies, including the, domestic political resolve of, let's call it, those who are historically associated with the earlier period of reform and opening, through to any disquiet from the Chinese entrepreneurial class. And so his ultimate view of resolving the contradictions is he has reached the correct conclusion. He believes that his resolution of this at a level of theory and ideology is right, and that others ultimately will fall into line because he has the discipline, endurance, and strategic patience of a long-term Leninist.
Is he right?
Is he right? That's like re-entering the Catholic Marxist confessional, isn't it? One thing that you and I have observed over many years, Orville, is one of the signature strengths of the Chinese communist system is their capacity for long-termism. Why do they have a capacity for long-termism? They don't have these pesky periodic interventions called democratic elections, which militate against long-termism, because we actually think in our systems of government that governments need to be re-legitimised through the agency of the ballot box. It's also a view which I happen to share, even when I've won elections and lost elections in the past myself. So is he right? On the question of long-term foreign policy and national security policy resolve, I would put it, my response would be in these terms. It is a fundamental challenge to the staying power of the United States and democratic allies around the world to see this through. The agency that I speak about here is not just the framework of strategic competition as it relates to China, but on the actual physicality of deterrence as it relates to Taiwan across the Taiwan Straits. Xi Jinping's worldview is he has more resolve, and the Chinese Leninist Party has more resolve than the rest of us. I don't see evidence at this stage, in the terms of the democratic world, that the democratic world is losing its resolve. That would be my answer to your question. Is he right on the domestic front? And this goes back to your earlier question about the reconciliation of domestic contradictions. I think the horns of the dilemma for Xi Jinping right now is that having resolved to take the country more to the Marxist left on the economy, and with growth slowing and unemployment among young people rising, and living standards not growing as rapidly as they did before, that there will be a necessary period of adjustment in the future. The early harbingers of which have been the moves on Chinese monetary policy and fiscal policy in the last few weeks, as they've sought to, shall we say, close the growth gap which is occurring as a consequence of the move to the Marxist left on the economy and the disenfranchisement of the Chinese private sector. So I think he sees himself as not needing to adjust fundamentally now on his economic policy settings. But I think as the economy continues to slow, which goes to your question of is he right or not, there is a certain reality which all political leaders have to face, that if the economy radically slows and living standards start to go backwards rather than remaining static or going forward, and you have a nation of tangping, of lying flat, then there will be a conclusion that an adjustment needs to occur.
So one question I get asked a lot is how much pragmatism Xi Jinping still has, because he's such an ideology man. And we saw that during the zero COVID period, right? Everybody knew that was not sustainable with Omicron. And he just resisted, and then 180 degrees and opened up like overnight. And what you mentioned about the stimulus measures, right? And people have been telling him since last year, you have to inject some money into the market to give people some way to, you have to save basically the housing market. And he resisted, and then boom, a bunch of stimulus measures. Like, people always ask, how much pragmatism does this man have versus his ideology?
I think if we were to compare three leaders here, Mao, Deng, and Xi Jinping, it would be along these lines. Mao, we would argue, was primarily an ideologue. He was also a military pragmatist. We need to bear that in mind as well. Deng Xiaoping was an economic pragmatist. We know that, and we've reflected in this discussion today on that 35-year history, which produced remarkable economic outcomes. And then thirdly, we look at Xi Jinping. The way in which I would characterize it is along these lines. Mao Zedong, being primarily an ideologue, but not exclusively, was a risk taker and, in my judgment, from time to time, a reckless risk taker. And sometimes the reckless risks paid off. Take, for example, the Korean War. Mao Zedong's decision to engage in the Korean War in 1950, within 6 months of the October 1 revolution, was the craziest exercise in national security risk-taking you could think of. The Americans had the bomb. China didn't have the bomb. And there he was, throwing 1 million Chinese troops across the Yalu. But guess what? he fought the Americans in their historiography, at least, to a standstill at the 38th parallel. If you flip to Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao were not risk takers. They were quintessential pragmatists. The way in which I characterize Xi Jinping, observing his behavior, particularly in foreign policy and security policy, is that he is a calculated risk taker. What's the evidence of that? Island reclamation in the South China Sea in the period of 1415. I mean, this was quite an audacious set of steps very early in Xi Jinping's rule, but he made a calculation in relation to the United States' likely strategic response that he could get away with it, and he did. And so I think, therefore, the way in which I would characterize this question of pragmatism, risk-taking, and ideology is to see that across that spectrum. Xi Jinping today is not a reckless risk-taker on the question of Taiwan. Xi Jinping today looks at the balance of forces across the Taiwan Straits. He is informed acutely by the deterrent actions by the United States, by the Taiwanese, by US allies, and by associated, shall we say, strategic collaborative arrangements between the US and its strategic partners around the world. And as he looks at that risk, he doesn't say, because of Marxism-Leninism and the inevitable victory of the Chinese Revolution, we're going to win this thing now. No, he's much more pragmatic than that. The open question, though, is in terms of the economy on the domestic front. Does this parallel, shall I say, strategic pragmatism or calculated risk-taking also have purchase? The signs that we've now had with monetary policy easing and with some fiscal policy easing occurring is that pragmatic voices are beginning to prevail. But here is the caveat. So far, we do not see anything beyond these, shall I say, fiscal and monetary policy interventions, which go back to the policy settings of the economy, which have been put in place through his decision to move China's economic strategy to the Marxist left and away from Deng's path of 35 years of pro-market, pro-reform, pro-opening economic pragmatism. So there is a pragmatic response to the growth gap, but as yet not a pragmatic response to, frankly, the underlying economic policy settings, which are about the balance between the private sector and the state-owned sector, the role of the market, as opposed to the role of industrial policy.
And also the social safety net.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess we only have time for one question. I want to ask, this is, do you think you now have a crystal ball? Now you've studied all Xi Jinping's soul. And
that's a very nicely put question, which I will now seek actively to evade. The elegance of your question is this, and this is where I'm hoisted by my own petard, which is, I've argued in this book that ideology is a significant, but not exclusive, predictor of downstream policy change and behavioural change. And I've sought to reconcile that against the history of Xi's first 10 years in office, from 2012 to 2020-22. So you legitimately asked me about the crystal ball, which is, that being the case, Kevin, then what about the next decade?
Yeah.
So the last 3 chapters of the book deal with this point. What I say in the book is that at a fundamental level, that because ideology is a significant predictor, we need to be very careful and sober in our analysis, therefore, about these 3 areas of change. Will the party become more or less Leninist in the decade ahead? I would say more Leninist, because there's nothing alive in anything which he has said or the ideological disciplines of the party which suggest to the contrary. What does that mean in practice? Less space for dissent, less space for dissenting voices, a more concentrated media discourse and official discourse, and less opportunity for even policy dissent within the machinery of the party. On the economy, which we've just discussed, I do not see yet any evidence of a fundamental reappraisal of where he's taken economic policy settings since 2017. I do not see evidence in either the Central Economic Work Conference, the Central Financial Work Conference, the major deliberative bodies of the party which set the parameters of market versus industrial policy, state-owned enterprises versus private sector, income distribution according to effort as opposed to common prosperity, etc. So I see this as continuing unless we get to a point where growth collapses, where you bring about a level of, shall I say, gestalt within the Chinese political economy debate, which causes a fundamental reappraisal. I do not see that at this stage. And on the external front, what do I see? Orville touched on this before, a hardening set of binaries with the United States and its allies, as reflected in the internal discourse of the party, but not to the point of what I would describe as a level of ideological triumphalism, which causes the system right now to believe that it will inevitably prevail. There is still a level of pragmatism evident in the Xi Jinping worldview, which militates against excessive risk-taking. I think these factors are my best read of the 5 to 10 years ahead as you go through the 21st Party Congress in 2027 and then on to the 22nd Party Congress by 2032, by which stage Xi Jinping will be pushing 80, but against Chinese leadership standards of Mao Zedong, who was an active political leader well through his 80s, and Deng Xiaoping, who was an active political leader well into his 80s. That is how I'd see this decade ahead unfolding.
It's quite depressing, right? But you did, I just want to mention one thing. You did mention in like the last pages of your book about China after Xi. I think, if I remember correctly, you basically argue that, you know, it's very likely China will swing back to the center after Xi. Is that right?
Depends how long Xi Jinping is in power. The argument I put in the book is that if he can sustain himself into not just the medium-term future, but the long-term future, then of course the ideological settings I describe in the book progressively over time do become more entrenched, particularly with a rising generation who have been more systematically imposed to Chinese ideological and nationalist education. And with a predisposition within the system now, and I think you've studied this more closely than I, Orville, for the Chinese party state no longer to comfortably employ and promote people who have been foreign educated. If, however, Xi Jinping is no longer the leader, say after the 22nd Party Congress in 2032, then what's the pattern that we see in post-49 history? In post-49 history, we have seen this evolving Chinese phenomenon of feng shui, which is of control and release, of control and release, of control and release. If you like, 56 was the first effort of saying, okay, you've had your 7 years of control, Mao, it's time to release a bit so we can get the economy rolling. And Mao reluctantly agrees and then launches the anti-rightist campaign in 1958, which then gave rise to the Great Leap Forward, which then gave rise to the Cultural Revolution. So Mao was saying, no, thank you. We're going to have more control, not less. And then you have the massive reaction to all of the above with what unfolded under Deng, saying this is excessive control, excessive class struggle, excessive centralization, excessive triumph of politics over the economy, and therefore we're going to have release, 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 release. Xi Jinping, in turn, represents a reaction at a dialectical level, if you like, in the way in which he would see it, against this excessive level of release of party discipline, of party indiscipline, of too much economic liberty, of too much social liberty, of too much personal liberty, and in terms of too much compromise to the US, the West, and the rest. And so in the whole scheme of Chinese history, then the folks within the Chinese system, in the party, in the military, in the academy, and in society who are uncomfortable about these changes at present, and there are many of them, and you know them all, is at a point when there is political change at the centre, then you can see in the medium to long term these forces in Chinese society and in politics bringing China back to equilibrium over time. Can I put a timetable around that? No. But I think if you look at the full sweep of post-49 history, this pattern has been in evidence, which is why I think it's very important for American audiences to always have in mind this thing. Whatever this country and US allies conclude about Xi Jinping one way or the other, we need to be very careful about reaching a conclusion that this country has a systemic adversary in China itself, or even in the full complexity of the CCP as it's evolved over time as well. There are a range of views within the CCP.
Could you imagine after Xi Jinping a Deng 2.0?
I'm glad we've now got to the end of our time.
I know.
because as you know, the Chinese system does not permit a debate about China after Xi, to then go to Deng 2.0. But what I'm saying is, we should just be sober. I mean, Orville, you're an acute student of Chinese party history. The evolution of this since '49 has these patterns, and therefore we should be very attentive to where these underpinning sociological forces, political forces within China go in a new set of realities in the event of future political change. What shape and form they take, it's unknown, and there is not a neat history of moving from one leader to the next like this, like that. But the underpinning sociological forces are the ones we describe.
Yeah. I found the chapters about China after Xi quite interesting. I highly recommend those chapters. How many minutes do we have? I'm sorry, I can't really say. 1 to 2 minutes? Sorry, let's take one question.
We can take a few.
Take a few. Maybe I can see a hand over there. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Thanks very much for the talk. Very fascinating. I wonder if you could speak to whether or not you see significant echoes of sort of traditional Chinese philosophy or ideology in Xi's own worldview. I think sometimes looking at like legalism in particular, it can feel like you're reading Xi's inner thoughts on ruling. And do you see that as a significant connection, or has it kind of been washed out by Marxism-Leninism?
I tried to, in chapter 3 of the book, look at the, let's call it traditional Chinese worldviews. I look carefully at Tianxia, all under heavenism. I look at the history of tributary statesism as it relates to the external environment. I also look at what we describe as legalist, realist concepts of power, both at home and abroad, particularly as they were shaped, for example, as you know, in the Warring States period, and people like good old Li Yuan and others who were deeply influential, at least in his own admission, of Mao Zedong's way of thinking as well, and his particular infatuation with Qin Shi Huang and the Qin dynasty. So I seek to canvass the traditions. If you read Xi Jinping's canon and what he's produced, he is not a huge reciter of the legalist tradition. However, what you do see are strong resonances of what people like Ian Johnson and others have described as China's culture of strategic realism. And so what I often say is here is Marxism-Leninism with its own millenarian view and its own view of dialectical materialism and historical materialism and the inevitable triumph of a revolutionary party, but always tempered with the strategic realism that you see from the Chinese legalists going back to Li Si, Han Feizi and the rest, which has been also a continuing tradition, both within Confucianism and elsewhere. And those resonances, I think, underpin what I described before in response to the questions from Li Yuan and others, that Xi Jinping is a calculated risk taker, and the calculus arises from elements of the continuing and resonant legalist tradition that you just referred to.
Okay, one more question. In the middle? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Rod. I have one question. There are certain views in China where people would think, for example, the constitution or the entire legal system sometimes matters more than people decide to Your view after Xi, or maybe even during his time, how much of a future path do you think China would be swayed towards maybe not fully a Western democratic system, but maybe more the Singaporean way of development, which is focusing more on the legal and order society, but still maybe maintaining one while putting itself in a global market economy.
You referred to constitutionalism just before. As you know, it has a long and checkered history, and let's call it the period since the Xinhai Revolution in 1911. And certainly one of Xi Jinping's great points of emphasis in the period since 2012 and 2013 has been a no-holds-barred attack on constitutionalism as a metaphor for creating a set of underpinning legal arrangements within a state which either A, constrained the power of the state in favour of the citizenry, and or B, constrained the power of the Communist Party as the principal actor within the Chinese state. And so those are the realities as they currently exist, and I'm sure you're familiar with that debate. In terms of its future evolution in China after Xi, we are genuinely entering into the speculative domain within speculative domains. I mean, Orville asked me before about Dung 2.0. What I find interesting, though, is that this debate about constitutionalism, this debate about, let's call it local democratic elections, this debate about, let's call it NPC, National People's Congress supervision, as it unfolded in first and second term Hu Jintao, was a pretty interesting, as it were, indicator of where nascent elements of, shall we say, long-term political reform lay within the Chinese system. Remember, in the Chinese system, the whole 政治体系改革 phenomenon has been around really since the days of the Shanghai World Economic Herald in the mid-80s, and certainly were part of what gave rise to much of the democratic reform movement of the late 80s. So it has been a tradition within post-Mao China. The question which we cannot, I was asked before about crystal ball, we cannot gaze through the mist of a crystal ball to say what will therefore happen to the rehabilitation of these political movements in a post-Xi Jinping China, other than to observe that in the 10-year period of Hu Jintao, they frankly went from nowhere to somewhere, to the extent that in the post-Hu Jintao period, Xi Jinping was absolutely explicit. He saw the future and didn't like it and closed the door. But this, therefore, represented a long-term threat, and it was shut down. But we can, I'm conscious of the time, but people haven't had much chance to ask questions. Why don't we take two more, and then I'll quickly, we'll
Over
quickly
there.
come to a close.
Hi, thank you for the fascinating talk. I'm really curious, Dr. Rudd, being ambassador from Australia to the U.S. and being in that foreign policy community, the U.S. has a disproportionate impact on how China sees itself and also how they want to respond. As you say, there is an element of Xi Jinping that is an ideologue, even a sort of a zealot. as you put it. And so I guess my question is how you think the U.S. should react or respond to China's rise and Xi Jinping's foreign policy sort of predisposition, and what might lead to a more sort of peaceful kind of ultimate outcome. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
It's a very broad set of questions. I'll just make one observation, given our constraints of time, and that is the United States always needs to be mindful as the world's superpower that it does have a large impact on the domestic political discourse within China itself, as your question acknowledged. Secondly, therefore, my continuing word of encouragement to friends in the United States Congress and to others in the US administration is to always be very mindful of forms of language in this country which in any way demonize the Chinese people, culture, civilization, or nation. This is self-evident to an audience such as this in the Asia Society, but it needs to be clearly understood across the body politic. Whatever policy and political disagreements exist between the administration and the Congress and the current Chinese administration need to be conducted in those terms, rather than resorting to broader stereotypic language. That's an important discipline for us all, because it does shape the internal discourse or have an impact on the internal discourse within China itself.
Mm-hmm. Last question. Okay, here.
Thank you so much. There are certain elements of Chinese political thought that seem, frankly, quite contradictory to leftist Marxist Leninism, referring to the enduring popularity of thinkers like Carl Schmitt, quite remarkably, the increasing cooperation with governments such as those of Russia and Hungary, frankly, the crackdown on Marxist student groups that was quite prevalent in 2018. So how do you kind of square that circle?
Well, as you know, without getting too much into the weeds on this, the internal CCP critique of, let's call it neo-Marxists, and a fear on the part of the party that a rediscovery of, shall we say, of a new left within the Chinese Communist Party was a significant challenge in terms of the party's hold on the policy debate. In the history of the party, as you know, it has always been somewhat easier to critique challenges from the right, neoliberalism in all its forms, capitalist rotas in all their forms, etc. A more problematic debate are those over here. I think my only response to your question is that if I go through carefully the Xi Jinping canon, his preoccupation from 2012-13 onwards has been the problems over here. And I think if you go through in particular the ideology and propaganda speech of 2013 and the series of subsequent speeches about, let's call it, political discipline within the overall operation, it is quite a small quantity of attention which is delivered to these problems of, quote, the new left, as opposed to these problems over here to the right as they would be perceived. And frankly, that's consistent, I think, with the Chinese tradition going back to Communist Party tradition to 1921. If you look at the tradition from 21, frankly, the earliest critiques of John Dewey and American liberalism right through the 20s and 30s, the public problem number one, I won't say public enemy number one, has always been seen in and around the forces of liberalism and within that, liberal democracy. And so therefore, I think these are seen as boutique, manageable problems in terms of the new left, particularly in the period after Xi met his end, as opposed to what is seen as being systemic and significant in terms of problems on the right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Orville. And thank you all for coming.